Welcome to another tale from the shadows, where mysteries unfold and stories come alive. Tonight's journey, the Song of the Nameless, reminds us that music holds secrets for those who dare to listen. Settle in as the melody begins. Emma Rodriguez understood music in a way few others did. Growing up in her grandfather's instrument workshop taught her that every violin and cello had its own voice. While he worked his magic on aged wood and delicate strings, she learned to hear the quiet songs hidden within them. His most important lesson stayed with her. Listen not just with your ears, but with your heart. At 15, she brought this gift to Oakwood Arts Academy. Her classmates were prodigies with famous last names, or the children of celebrated musicians. Emma, by contrast, arrived with a scholarship and a cello her grandfather had restored from near ruin. She didn't have a legacy, but she had determination. Oakwood's expectations were very strict. Technical excellence and artistic discipline were more than expectations. They were rules. Emma practiced harder than anyone else, determined to match the perfection her teachers demanded. But every time she walked through the academy gates, she felt the weight of being different, an outsider among the elite. The old academy building seemed to understand. During the day, it was all polished floors and proper lessons. But in the quiet hours, when most students had gone home, the halls whispered different songs. Notes lingered in empty practice rooms. Melodies drifted through the walls, tempting her to explore. Her teachers never quite knew what to make of her. Emma shows exceptional promise, they wrote in reports, but she often follows melodies only she can hear. Each time she read those words, she felt a familiar twist of worry. Excellence at Oakwood meant following the rules, not chasing mysterious harmonies. That's why she stayed late most evenings, practicing until every note was perfect. But once the rushing footsteps faded and the last locker clicked shut, she sometimes allowed herself to listen to what the building wanted to tell her. On this particular Thursday, Emma stayed well past sunset. A light autumn rain tapped against the windows as she practiced in room 413. Working through a challenging piece for the winter showcase. Something felt different about the room tonight. Each note from her cello echoed just a bit longer, as if the walls were holding on to the sound. She first noticed the change when she played the low G string. The note resonated oddly, making the old wooden metronome on the shelf vibrate. Before she could reach it, it toppled forward and hit the floor. The impact separated the heavy wooden base from its pyramid body, revealing a yellowed paper folded carefully inside, a piece of sheet music, somehow perfectly preserved despite its age. The sheet music she held seemed to breathe. The paper felt warm against her fingers, like sun-touched wood. No composer had signed their name, no title graced the top of the page. Just notes that somehow shifted when she wasn't looking directly at them. Emma knew every piece in the Academy's library. She'd spent countless hours exploring the archives, but she'd never seen notation quite like this. The staff lines flowed like water, and the notes themselves seemed to whisper. Her cello responded to the mysterious score without being played. The strings hummed softly, like they recognized an old friend. In her grandfather's workshop, Emma had learned that instruments sometimes chose their own songs. This felt like one of those moments. She should have taken it to Miss Sullivan in the archives. That would have been the sensible choice. But the melody line seemed to call to her, each note promising something extraordinary. Besides, how could she turn it in without knowing its song? Emma positioned her cello carefully. She took a steady breath, the way her grandfather had taught her. Then she drew her bow across the strings, ready to play the first note of the nameless song. The first note emerged like morning mist. Emma played it softly, letting the strange melody find its voice through her cello. The sound filled the room 413 differently than any piece she'd played before. It didn't just echo, it seemed to search the shadows as if looking for something. Her hands trembled slightly on the second measure. The notes on the page shifted under her gaze, rearranging themselves like curious creatures. She almost stopped playing then, almost packed up her cello and ran. But something in the melody pulled at her, drawing her deeper into its mystery. At first, She thought the movement in the corner was just shadows cast by the rain outside. She blinked hard, trying to focus on the sheet music. But there it was again, a darkness gathering like spilled ink, taking shape in impossible ways. Emma's bow faltered for a moment, but the melody seemed to play itself through her fingers, refusing to be stopped.
"Hello?" she whispered, her voice shaking. No one answered, but the shadows grew stronger. They gathered like watercolors bleeding on paper, forming figures that seemed almost, but not quite, human. Emma's heart raced, but her bow kept moving across the strings, as if the music itself refused to let her stop. As the melody grew stronger, so did they. Each new measure brought more shadows to life. A princess emerged from behind the music stand, her crown unfinished, her gown shifting between styles as if it couldn't decide which era it belonged to. Emma stifled a nervous laugh. She must be hallucinating from too much practice. But then, a figure in a detective's hat stepped out of the wall, holding what looked like a magnifying glass, though parts of him remained as transparent as smoke. "This isn't happening," Emma muttered, but her fingers kept playing. More characters appeared with each measure. A young boy with a toy boat that left ripples in the air. A painter whose brush stroked colors into nothing. The room felt crowded now with half-formed stories, each one drawn to her music like moths to a flame. A distant door slammed somewhere in the building. Emma jumped, her bow skidding across the strings. The sudden discord scattered the shadows like startled birds. In that moment, reality crashed back in. She was alone in room 413 after hours, playing strange music instead of practicing for the winter showcase. Her hands shook as she packed up her cello. The mysterious sheet music seemed to whisper as she folded it and tucked it into her case. The shadows in the room's corners stirred hopefully, but Emma couldn't stay. She needed time to think, to make sense of what had just happened. As she hurried home through the rain, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that she had just sight-read the first page of a much longer story, one that, for better or worse, she was now part of. That night, Emma sat at her desk, the mysterious sheet music laid out before her. Her small bedroom, filled with music books and practice schedules, felt different somehow. Even the familiar scent of rosin that usually brought comfort now seemed to carry whispers of its own. She should have been working on her showcase piece. Instead, her thoughts kept drifting back to room 413, to the princess with her ever-changing gown, to the detective searching for an unwritten mystery, to all those unfinished stories that had filled the room like morning fog. Her phone buzzed. 3 messages from Maya about tomorrow's music theory test. Emma started to reply, then stopped. How could she focus on chord progressions after what she'd seen? She thought about telling Maya, but what would she say? "Hey, I played some strange music and now ghost stories are coming to life." Emma carefully tucked the sheet music into her old theory notebook. Tomorrow was another day, another practice session, another chance to understand what she'd discovered. For now, though, she needed sleep. But as she drifted off, she could have sworn she heard a faint melody drifting from her cello case, a lullaby for unfinished dreams. Morning at Oakwood brought its usual routine. Students rushed through corridors, instrument cases bumping against backpacks. But Emma saw everything differently now. She noticed how shadows lingered in corners, how music from practice rooms blended in strange ways, how some notes seemed to hang in the air longer than they should. During theory class, she could barely focus. Maya kept shooting her concerned glances. The sheet music in her notebook seemed to pulse with each tick of the classroom clock. When Miss Sullivan played examples on the piano, Emma swore she saw faint shapes forming in the sunbeams that streamed through the windows. "Earth to Emma," Maya poked her with a pencil. "Are you okay? You haven't said a word all morning." Emma opened her mouth to respond, but another sound caught her attention. From somewhere in the building came a melody, haunting and familiar. The same melody she'd played yesterday, but different somehow, sadder, like a cry for help. "I need to check something," Emma said, gathering her books. "Cover for me?" She followed the melody through empty corridors and past locked practice rooms until it led her to a quiet corner of the Academy's old library wing. Emma stopped short, her heart jumping into her throat. There they were, not just shadows this time, but clearer in the morning light. The detective bent over a silent piano, his transparent fingers moving across the keys. The princess twirled without sound, her unfinished gone catching impossible light. They were real. Last night hadn't been a dream or a practice-induced hallucination. Emma stood frozen between the library shelves, watching her impossible shadows from last night move in the morning light. Before she could decide whether to run, a new figure emerged from between the rows of sheet music. The librarian's form settled as she approached, becoming an elderly woman with silver hair and eyes that held countless stories. She cradled an ever-changing book in her arms like a precious thing. "We wondered who would find it," she said, her voice soft as turning pages. "The metronome has been waiting quite a while." She gestured to the unfinished characters around them. "They've all been waiting." Emma clutched her notebook tighter. Her mouth felt dry. Who are they?" Stories that never found their ending. Characters abandoned mid-tale. Dreams that slipped away before morning. The librarian ran her fingers along a shelf, leaving trails of gentle light. "Every unfinished story comes here, to the spaces between music and memory." The detective tipped his hat again. The princess smoothed her ever-changing gown. Emma noticed how they all seemed to lean toward the sheet music in her notebook, like flowers turning to sunlight. "But why me?" Emma asked, her voice barely a whisper. "And why now?" The librarian smiled, her glasses catching the dusty light. "You heard them. Not everyone can." A bell rang somewhere in the main building. Emma jumped at the sound of the real world intruding. "I have to go," she said, suddenly remembering everything else. Classes, grades, the showcase. "I have class, and the winter showcase to practice for, and—" "Of course you do," the librarian nodded. "Stories can't live on music alone. But remember, you've started playing their song now, and unfinished tales have a way of seeking their endings." As Emma hurried back to her regular classes, she could have sworn she saw the detective's notebook appear on her desk, its pages blank but somehow full of possibility. The rest of the school day passed in a blur. Emma went through her classes mechanically, her mind returning again and again to the library scene. The detective's notebook sat in her bag, its weight somehow both real and impossible. At her regular practice time, Emma found herself outside room 413 again. The old metronome still lay where she'd left it, its broken bass a reminder that yesterday hadn't been a dream. She set up her music stand but didn't open her showcase piece. Instead, she took out the mysterious sheet music and the detective's notebook. The blank pages seemed to whisper possibilities. Emma thought about her grandfather's words about instruments choosing their songs, about the librarian's message, about unfinished stories seeking their endings. She lifted her bow to the strings, then hesitated. Playing this music again would change everything. She had the winter showcase coming up, her grades to maintain, her scholarship to think about. But then she remembered how the princess's unfinished crown had sparkled with potential, how the detective's unsolved mystery hung in the air like an unfinished sentence. All those characters, all those stories, waiting for someone who could hear their song. Emma took a deep breath and began to play. This time she was ready when the shadows started to dance. This time the music felt different. Each note seemed surer, more purposeful. The shadows gathered quickly, as if they'd been waiting just out of sight. The princess emerged first, her unfinished crown catching light that wasn't there. The detective followed, his notebook now a twin to the one in Emma's bag. But something had changed. As Emma played, she noticed the characters moving with more confidence. The princess's gown settled into a definite style, though one from no particular era Emma could name. The detective's magnifying glass began to show actual reflections, even if they were reflections of things that weren't in the room. New figures joined them. A young boy with a toy boat that actually bobbed on invisible waves. A painter whose brush stroked colors into the air. Each measure of music brought more clarity to their unfinished forms. Then Emma reached a part of the melody she hadn't played before. The notes twisted in unexpected ways, creating harmonies that seemed impossible on a single cello. The detective opened his notebook and began to write. Real words appeared on the page, though they faded almost as quickly as Emma could read them. "The music is changing," the princess said, her voice a whisper of half-formed sound. "It's never done that before." Emma's fingers found notes she was sure hadn't been on the page yesterday. The melody grew, becoming something new, something that brought more definition to the shadows around her, more life to their unfinished stories. The painter raised his brush, and for a moment Emma saw what he was trying to create, a landscape that shifted between seasons, waiting for its final form. The boy's toy boat left ripples in the air that carried fragments of adventure stories. Even the detective's notebook began to fill with possibilities, cases that needed solving, mysteries that needed endings. When the last note faded, Emma realized something important. The sheet music wasn't just a song that revealed unfinished stories. It was changing, growing, becoming a bridge between their world and hers. And somehow she was helping to write this new melody. The sound of slow, deliberate footsteps in the hallway made everyone freeze. The shadows flickered nervously. Emma recognized those footsteps. Miss Sullivan, making her evening rounds through the practice rooms. The door handle turned. Emma clutched her bow tighter as the characters around her began to fade. But they didn't disappear completely. Instead, they seemed to settle into the corners of the room, becoming almost, but not quite, invisible. Miss Sullivan stood in the doorway, her silver-rimmed glasses reflecting the late afternoon light. Her eyes moved from the broken metronome on the floor to Emma's cello, then to the sheet music on the stand. Something shifted in her expression. Not surprise exactly, but recognition. "I wondered when it would surface again," she said softly. She stepped into the room and closed the door behind her. "Though I didn't expect it to choose a cellist this time." Emma's mind raced. "This time?" Miss Sullivan smiled, and for a moment her appearance seemed to waver, like a reflection in moving water. Emma caught a glimpse of something familiar in that shimmer, the same kind of unfinished quality she'd seen in the shadows. "Did you think you were the first?" Miss Sullivan picked up the broken metronome with careful hands. "Every generation, the music finds someone who can hear the unfinished stories, someone who might help write their endings." She paused, adjusting her glasses. "Or perhaps their new beginnings." In the corners of the room, the shadows stirred with interest. The detective's notebook in Emma's bag suddenly felt warmer, more alive with possibility. Miss Sullivan pulled up a chair, her movements careful as if she was aware of every shadow in the room. She held the broken metronome in her lap like an old friend. 30 years ago, I was a piano student here," she began. "The music found me during my senior recital. Back then, it was hidden in an old music box." She smiled at a memory. "My unfinished characters were quite different from yours. A sailor with an unmapped ocean, a watchmaker who could fix time itself, a gardener who grew dreams instead of flowers." The shadows in the corner stirred at her words. Emma's own characters emerged slightly, drawn by the story. The princess's crown sparkled with new light, and the detective pulled out his notebook. "What happened to them?" Emma asked. "Your characters? Some found their endings, others?" Miss Sullivan's form wavered again, more noticeably this time. "Others chose to stay, to help guide the next generation of stories." She gestured to herself, and Emma understood. Miss Sullivan wasn't just a teacher who knew about the music. She was one of the unfinished characters herself. "But you seem so..." Emma struggled to find the right word. "Real?" Miss Sullivan laughed softly. "Stories that find their purpose can become quite solid in this world, even if they're not quite finished." She reached into her jacket and pulled out a small, worn notebook. "I chose to stay and watch over the music, to help others like you when they discovered it." The detective stepped forward, his own notebook glowing faintly. Miss Sullivan nodded to him in recognition. Each generation brings new stories, new possibilities, but this time, she looked at Emma's cello with wondering eyes. "This time the music is changing, growing. I've never heard it adapt itself like this before." The melody was interrupted by the sound of a pipe organ chord echoing through the halls. The shadows scattered like startled birds. Even Miss Sullivan's form seemed to grow fainter. "Ah," she whispered, "he's noticed." The temperature in room 413 dropped. Through the windows, Emma watched as the sunset light bent unnaturally, as if being rewritten. Each footstep that approached brought with it the sound of closing books, final curtain calls, and the sharp scratch of signatures being penned. Sir Reginald Penworth III appeared in the doorway like a painting demanding its own frame. His tailcoat was the deep blue of a final twilight, each button a tiny golden masterpiece. In one hand, he held a cane topped with a crystalline quill that moved constantly, completing everything it touched, adding periods to sentences, signing off on songs, closing curtains on plays. "Well, well," he said, his voice carrying the weight of leather-bound volumes. "What do we have here?" "More unfinished specimens." He surveyed the room as if evaluating an untidy library. His quill flicked disapprovingly in the air, drawing perfect circles around each shadowy figure. The princess's half-formed crown dimmed. The detective's notebook began to close itself. Around them, the very air seemed to fill with the whispers of endings, the final notes of symphonies, the last brush strokes of masterpieces, the closing bows of perfect performances. "These fragments don't belong in Oakwood," Sir Reginald continued, each word precisely measured. "Our halls celebrate completion, perfect symphonies, flawless performances, art in its highest, most finished form." His quill punctuated each statement with a golden flourish. Emma stood, her bow steady in her hand. "These aren't just drafts," she said. "They're dreams still finding their shape, work still growing, like music that's still being composed." Sir Reginald's laugh was the sound of a book firmly closing. "My dear girl, art without endings is merely noise." But as he gestured dismissively, Emma noticed something odd about his movements. When his cane swept through the air, it left trails of unfinished melodies. The shadow of his tailcoat didn't move quite right, as if other stories were trying to emerge from its folds. Emma watched as Sir Reginald moved through room 413, like a conductor demanding perfection. With each tap of his cane, the room seemed to straighten itself. Sheet music aligned at perfect angles. The broken metronome ticked once, then fell silent, now merely an antique, stripped of its magic. But it was what happened to the unfinished characters that truly caught her attention. The princess's gown, which had been shifting through styles and eras, suddenly froze into a single rigid design. The detective's ever-changing mystery solidified into a simple, predictable case. Even the painter's swirling colors settled into flat, lifeless shades. "Much better," Sir Reginald nodded, his quill adding finishing touches to the air. "Proper endings, no loose threads." Yet something wasn't right. As Emma looked closer, she saw tiny cracks in his perfect facade. When he passed the old piano in the corner, its keys played a few notes of an unfinished melody, one he quickly silenced. The edge of his tailcoat rippled with half-formed dance steps. His shadow performed scenes from plays that had never seen their final act. "Why do you hate them so much?" Emma asked, her bow still ready. "The unfinished pieces?" "Hate." Sir Reginald turned sharply, and for a moment a sketch of a young artist flickered across his face. "I preserve art in its highest form. These incomplete things," he gestured at the fading characters, "they're reminders of failure, of imperfection, of all the art that wasn't good enough to reach its final form." Emma lifted her bow to her cello strings. "Or maybe," she said softly, "they're reminders of something else." She played a single note, letting it hang in the air. The shadows stirred. The princess's gown began to shift again, fighting against its fixed form. "Stop that," Sir Reginald commanded, but his voice wavered. As Emma played another note, she saw more clearly. His perfect suit was made of canvas waiting to be painted. His golden quill leaked unwritten poems, and in his eyes she caught the reflection of every unfinished symphony he'd ever silenced. Something in Emma's music made Sir Reginald's perfect posture falter. His cane trembled, the quill's golden glow flickering like a candle in wind. For just a moment, he looked smaller, younger, a boy in an oversized coat standing before a grand piano. "I was here once," he said, his voice losing its sharp edges. 50 years ago, the youngest student ever admitted to Oakwood." His shadow shifted,
showing a child prodigy performing for stern-faced judges. They said I had the talent to create masterpieces. Emma played another gentle note. Around them, the unfinished characters paused, sensing a story unfolding. But nothing I made was ever good enough. His quill wrote faster now, more frantically. Every piece needed one more revision. Every performance could be more perfect. There was always something. He practically whispered the word, unfinished. The shadows in his coat rippled, revealing glimpses of half-written symphonies, unfinished concertos, dances that never reached their final step. Emma saw what had happened. He had never finished a single piece, not because he couldn't, but because he wouldn't allow himself to create anything less than perfection. So I became the keeper of finished works instead. He straightened again, but his voice held a tremor. If I couldn't create perfection, I could at least preserve it, protect it, keep these messy, unfinished things from tainting true art. Miss Sullivan stepped forward, her form wavering between teacher and story. "Reggie," she said softly, using a name that made him flinch. "We wondered what happened to you after that last recital. You were there?" The question escaped him before he could maintain his composure. "The whole school came to hear you play, but when you saw the crowd," Miss Sullivan's voice trailed off. "I couldn't bear to show them something imperfect," he said. His shadow was fully visible now. A young pianist frozen at the keyboard, surrounded by endless variations of the same unfinished piece. Emma understood. Sir Reginald wasn't destroying unfinished art. He was trying to protect everyone else from what he feared most, the possibility of imperfection, the chance of failure, the terror of showing the world something incomplete. She lifted her bow once more, but this time she played the mysterious melody differently. She let it be imperfect, let it stumble and soar and find its own way. As Emma played the mysterious melody one final time, something extraordinary began to happen. The unfinished characters, instead of shrinking from Sir Reginald's presence, began moving toward him like pieces of a living puzzle finding their places. The princess's crown shifted and changed, each version reflecting a different story. The detective's notebook scattered its mysteries into the air like clues waiting to be rearranged. The young boy's toy boat sailed through these floating fragments, leaving ripples that connected one tale to another. The painter stepped forward, his brush weaving these pieces together in new ways. The detective's magnifying glass revealing details in the princess's story. The boy's boat carrying characters across genres, creating adventures that had never been imagined before. Other characters emerged from the corners of room 413. A composer whose notes danced between finished and unfinished symphonies. A sculptor whose clay figures stepped into other stories, becoming part of new tales. A dancer whose movements connected scattered narratives like bridges made of starlight. Emma's music wove through them all, the mysterious sheet music changing as she played. New notes appeared, not completing the piece but connecting it to other melodies, other stories. The music carried echoes of Sir Reginald's unfinished concerto, but instead of trying to perfect it, it braided it with other unfinished works, creating something that was whole precisely because it welcomed its incomplete parts. "You see," Emma said gently, still playing. "They're not broken pieces. They're stories still finding each other." The young boy sailed his boat through the princess's dance, creating waves of inspiration. The detective followed these trails, his notes becoming part of a larger mystery. The painter's colors filled in the spaces between, showing how each fragment enhanced the others. Sir Reginald's quill trembled, then slowly, hesitantly, began to write something new, not endings anymore, but bridges between stories. His shadow of the young pianist finally moved, touching the keys of an invisible piano. The note he played joined Emma's melody. Uncertain at first, then growing stronger. A single piece that made the whole puzzle richer for its presence. Emma's cello sang louder, the melody growing stronger as each unfinished story joined in. The princess's dance became a counterpoint. The detective's mysteries added harmony. The boy's sailing adventures brought rhythm to the piece. Sir Reginald's shadow piano wove through it all, adding notes he'd been afraid to play for 50 years. The music swelled, and the walls of room 413 seemed to fade away. Emma found herself on the stage of Oakwood's majestic Grand Theater, its soaring golden arches and rows upon endless rows of seats stretching into the shadows. The space was both awe-inspiring and terrifying, exactly the kind of venue that had always made her doubt whether she was ready, whether she was good enough. But somehow tonight, that fear transformed into something else. The warm lights caught the rich wood of her cello, the last instrument her grandfather had restored before his hands grew too shaky for the delicate work. She played the final measures, her bow dancing across the strings. In the front row, Miss Sullivan smiled, her form solid, yet somehow still magical. Beside her sat Sir Reginald, his quill now writing not endings, but new chapters. The mysterious sheet music on her stand looked complete, yet somehow still held the promise of more stories to come. In that sea of faces, she caught a glimpse of her mother, tears streaming down her face, radiating such pride that Emma felt her own heart swell. This was more than just a performance. It was magic coming to life. The last note soared to the highest reaches of the theater. For a heartbeat, there was absolute silence. Then the applause erupted like a tidal wave, starting from the orchestra seats and rolling up to the highest balcony. The sound was deafening, thunderous. Hundreds of hands coming together, feet stamping, voices calling out. The crystal chandelier trembled, catching and scattering light like stars falling from the ceiling. Emma took her final bow, clutching her cello close as the applause continued to wash over her in waves. Around her, the shadows of unfinished stories seemed to dance in the stage lights. When she finally made her way backstage, her hands were still trembling from the performance. The old corridors of Oakwood's theater buzzed with excitement. She could hear the murmur of the crowd making its way to the grand reception hall, where performers traditionally greeted their audience after significant performances. The reception hall itself was a magnificent space, with its sweeping marble staircase and towering mirrors that seemed to hold echoes of past performances. As Emma entered, still flushed from the stage, Maya was the first to reach her, practically bouncing with excitement. "I knew you were hiding something," Maya exclaimed, hugging her friend. "That wasn't like anything I've ever heard before." Emma noticed a small notebook peeking from Maya's pocket, its pages now shimmering with unwritten stories of its own. Her mother found her next, wrapping her in a tight embrace that said more than words could express. Around them, classmates gathered in excited clusters, their whispered conversations carrying echoes of their own unfinished dreams. Even the most serious seniors, who usually kept to themselves, came forward to congratulate her. Teachers nodded approvingly as they passed, their own artistic souls stirring with new inspiration. Each voice that congratulated her carried whispers of their own unfinished stories, no longer hiding but proudly showing their potential. Miss Sullivan beamed with the pride of a character who had helped write her own ending, and Sir Reginald, his perfect posture now relaxed, smiled like someone who had finally learned to enjoy a story without rushing to its final page. As the crowd of well-wishers thinned, Emma noticed Miss Sullivan and Sir Reginald waiting patiently by the grand staircase. The old music master's perfect posture remained, but something had changed. His eyes held a warmth she'd never seen before. "Quite an extraordinary piece," he said, his quill now writing gentle suggestions instead of harsh endings. "Perhaps the Hall of Completed Works could use a section for songs still being written." He reached into his tailcoat and withdrew an elegant leather-bound volume. As he opened it, Emma caught glimpses not of finished pieces, but of beginnings. Countless first measures and opening notes that held worlds of potential. Miss Sullivan smiled, her form shifting softly between teacher and story. "Some music," she said, "isn't meant to be finished. Sometimes the beauty lies in letting it grow." Emma hugged her cello close, watching as shadows of unfinished stories danced freely among the departing students, finding homes in scattered sketchbooks and half-written compositions. The mysterious sheet music in her hands hummed softly, its notes still shifting and changing, not seeking an ending anymore, but offering new beginnings. A few weeks later, Emma found herself back in room 413. The old metronome sat repaired on its shelf, ticking away to a rhythm that seemed to change depending on who was listening. The mysterious sheet music had found a new home, not hidden away, but proudly displayed in a special case in the Hall of Completed Works, right next to Sir Reginald's leather-bound Book of Beginnings. The hall itself had changed. Where once only finished masterpieces hung, now students' works in progress filled special spaces between the frames. Rough sketches conversed with completed paintings, half-written symphonies danced with classic compositions. Even the rigid golden plaques had softened their tone, now reading Art in Progress and Stories Becoming. During evening practice sessions, it wasn't uncommon to glimpse shadows moving through Oakwood's halls. A detective helping a struggling writer find their plot, a princess inspiring a timid dancer's choreography, a boy with a toy boat teaching young musicians about rhythm and flow. Sir Reginald could often be found in the practice rooms, his quill now offering gentle suggestions rather than final judgments. As Emma packed up her cello that evening, Maya poked her head through the door. Ready for the showcase next week? Emma smiled, watching the shadows of new stories gathering in the corners of room 413. Her piece wasn't finished yet, and somehow that felt exactly right. The end, or perhaps the beginning. And there you have it, dear listeners. The tale of Emma Rodriguez and the unfinished stories that found their voice through her music. But perhaps some stories are best left unfinished. After all, that's where new beginnings hide. If you enjoyed this journey into the shadows where fear meets fortune and darkness dances with delight, don't forget to leave a like. It helps other wandering souls find these tales in the night. And if you're brave enough to hear more stories from the spaces between music, subscribe and ring that bell. There are always more mysteries waiting to be told. Until next time, remember, every ending is just another story, beginning to unfold.